Hey everyone, and welcome back. I am super excited to welcome back the mega talented Molly Suber Thorpe. How are you, Molly?
I'm doing really well, Tom. Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
Always great to welcome you back. What are you going to be sharing with the community today? I think this is going to be a really fun, really unique session.
Thank you. I'm going to be talking about adding depth or dimension to calligraphy. So it's really about making 3D calligraphy essentially, and I'm going to show you a couple ways to do it that hopefully will get your juices flowing. You'll just be super inspired to make tons of it on your own.
Love it.
Okay. So I'm just starting today with a high-res square canvas. I often teach in square canvases because it makes for, great Instagram images when you're done with your beautiful compositions. So I'm starting out here with this blank canvas, and I'm just going to throw a couple guides down for myself because I'm just going to whip out some calligraphy first, and then we're going to add the dimension to it. So let me come over to my calligraphy composition maker, and I'm just going to choose this really simple, modern 72-degree slant calligraphy guide here. And I'm stamping it once on my screen, and then I'll hit transform. And I'm actually going to turn it at an angle. I don't have to do this, but I kind of like the look of having a slant in addition to the dimension. I think it adds a further sense of dimension and sort of movement and perspective and flow. So turning on uniform at the bottom, I'm going to enlarge this even more. I'm only going to make one word today. Of course, this could be done with the whole composition, but adding the dimension takes a bit of time. So doing it in one word, I'll be able to show you everything I have to show you. If you did do this in multiple lines, though, of course, you could, of course, duplicate your layer and just keep repeating this down the page to create the perfect calligraphic slanted grid. Okay, so I'll reduce the opacity on this slightly and make a new blank layer. Switch over to black. And then I'll switch over to my calligraphy nibs pack. Now, traditionally, pointed pen calligraphy has these really thin hairlines followed by really thick downstrokes. And that contrast is what brings the elegance into calligraphy, pointed pen script calligraphy. And we're sticking with that contrast today. However, we want to boost the width of those upstrokes just a bit, because adding dimension to fine hairlines it's not super legible, and it's much easier if we have a little bit of weight to work with. So I'm actually going to select my thick nib calligraphy pen, and I'll choose the smooth setting for the stroke texture. And now you can see that it still has contrast, but the contrast is somewhat decreased. So my hairlines are not as much hairlines as they were a minute ago. Now, if you've watched my other sessions, you probably also know that I frequently start with pencil sketching, but I'm not going to do that today because I really just want to dive in to making the dimensional artwork with you. So I'm just going to whip out some calligraphy here. I might go over it one more time, but I'm not going to spend too long honing it and perfecting it. Just going to do one big word across the page, adhering to these guides. Do I like that? Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. It's good. And then
I love what a perfectionist you are, Molly.
I mean, let's be real. If I were here by myself, I would redo this 25 times. So you're seeing me draft mode, let's call it that. You can see one thing I did here, speaking of details, though, is that I brought the left leg of this M down below the baseline. And I did that on purpose because one thing that I personally enjoy doing in dimensional calligraphy is making the ends of all of my strokes really flat. I think that adds a really cool effect. So I'm actually going to come in and flatten all of these, maybe at even little angles. I just kind of, you'll see once we do the dimension, I just kind of like what that does when the dimension and the 3D effect is there. Now I'll come back with my pen and I'll reduce its size a lot. And I'm just going to come into areas that maybe are a bit too thin and just thicken them up a little bit. I'm not even being a perfectionist here. This is in a way going to sort of blend in with the dimension that we do. But you see how this area has a really thin region? I just want to thicken that a little bit. So yeah, just make sure that there's a bit more uniformity in the strokes than you might care about under normal circumstances if you're just doing calligraphy. All right, I think this is mostly good though. And to reiterate, you can actually use lots of different types of lettering pens for this. I just think that the contrast between thick and thin is something that really adds a lot to this particular effect. Okay, cool. So that's good. I don't think that any of these thin lines are too thin. So I'll zoom right back out. I'll select this word. I'm going to turn on snapping for myself for a lot of the class because I tend to like to just know if I'm centering things properly. So I'll center that and turn off the grid. So we're going to call this layer, let's just call it the primary layer. We're going to be duplicating it a lot, so I'm naming it for you so that we don't get confused when you're looking at my screen. This is going to be the layer that is at the top, the main word, right? We're going to now duplicate it and take the one that's underneath the primary layer. I want to rename this dimension, if I can spell it correct. Okay, so now you can't see the difference, right? One is atop the other. And if I were to move this dimension layer, it's also black. It's hard to distinguish any contrast. So I'm going to recolor it first, recolor both of these, in fact, first to create a high contrast difference in their colors so that when I'm working to create the dimension, I can really see what I'm doing. So there are many ways to recolor. I'm going to just do a really basic one today. I'm going to start with a light color for my primary lettering. Tap once, hit select. I could hit alpha lock also here, and then tap again and say fill layer. And now we have just this top primary layer being pink. And I'll turn that off for a second. I'll tap and hit select. And I'll go to a darker color, I think, and fill layer. So now I have these two layers stacked on top of each other. Now I can take my dimension layer, I can take my selection tool, and I can move the bottom layer around. In fact, now I'll turn off snapping for a second just so that we can see the nuance of how we can move this around. If I move it only slightly, you can see that the dimension has already been created somewhat, but I want to create dramatic dimension today. And we're also going to create a drop shadow on top of that. So I'm going to see which way I want the dimension to go. I have 4 basic options. I can go down to the left, down to the right, up to the right, up to the left. I know I want to go down today. How about I go down to the right? Okay, and then I'll tap my selection tool to deselect this. Now, on my dimension layer, I'm a stickler about making sure that I never do permanent changes that I can never completely undo. So I'm just going to duplicate this and turn off the bottom layer because I'm about to make changes to the dimension layer that will be hard to undo later. So let me tap that to select it. And now I'm coming to my monoline pen that's part of my calligraphy nibs pack. The reason I'm choosing monoline is because pressure sensitivity is actually not what I want anymore. A little fix. I just zoomed in here and see that the color, I hope you can see this at home, the color of my light pink layer didn't fully fill with pink. So I'm going to tap it again and I'm going to do like the real way this time. Alpha lock, tap, fill layer, tap again, turn off alpha lock. Okay, so now we have our light pink layer and our darker dimension layer. All right, making sure I'm on that darker color and I'm on a monoline pen so there's no pressure sensitivity. I'm going to get a pretty thin brush, and what I want to do is connect the end points all around the word. So for example, I'm connecting these 2 corresponding points. I'm connecting these corresponding points. When it comes to curves, Your corresponding points are, if you can envision like a tangent line running along the most outer point of the curve, you're connecting those two tangent points. So what that looks like in reality is this. Oops, that was a bit much. Let's do a bigger curve difference. Here, we're connecting this point of the primary layer to this point of the dimension layer. But remember, we're drawing on the dimension layer. We're not drawing on the primary layer. All right, so we can go around. We can do this to every letter if we want. But I show you this method because I personally find, for me, this was the best way for me to learn how dimension works. Going around and doing this really helped me wrap my brain around how, like, the angles of a line of dimension. I'll just tell you honestly that in art school, I had a teacher who just flat out said to me one day, some people will just never understand perspective. So he said that to me in reality. So I have struggled with perspective. And I say that to you because this is something that a lot of people do struggle with and say, but I don't know where to connect and what angles to use. So I'm just telling you, I struggled with it a little bit too in the beginning, but forcing myself to go around entire words, entire compositions, and connect these outer points, that is what taught me how dimension actually works and how shadows actually fall and work. So this is extremely good for practice and learning, in addition to creating really precise and beautiful dimension. So I'm going to pause there for a second and scoot back over to my A toward the beginning. What you would then do is increase your pen size, say, and fill in all of the space between your primary and your dimension layer. So I find this really meditative. I know that for me, it's essentially like using a coloring book, filling in all of these spaces by hand. The reason I don't come in and use this other method of dragging my swatch to fill the space is because that would happen. If I turn off my primary layer, you see that there's actually no filled space currently right there between the primary and the dimension layer. So there are a number of ways of going about filling this. When I do it myself, I just fill it in by hand because I enjoy that so much. But you can also draw yourself second lines to create an enclosed space and then drag and drop and fill that.
That looks so elegant already, Molly.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Really, really cool effect.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to finish the A in this classic traditional method, and then I'm going to show you a brilliant shortcut that's going to do it for you. But I want to teach you this method because it really, really is extremely important and helpful for learning dimension and shadow. So Tom is correct that even when you're in here, zoomed into the file, you can just already see that the dimension is there. It's just popping. So I'm going to turn this dimension layer off for a moment. You can see that maybe it would take me another full 5 minutes, 10 minutes to finish this. No big deal. Like I said, I find it really enjoyable, but I'm going to show you a way to do this much, much faster. So keep in your mind how this looked so far. I'm going to turn off my dimension layer now. I'm going to duplicate my primary layer again and keep the top one as my primary layer. Underneath it, I'm now creating a new type of dimension. I'm going to rename this one Quick Dimension because this is like my shortcut way of doing dimension. Okay. And just like before, I'm going to darken this already so that the contrast will be immediately obvious. Turning off my primary layer so that we can just view this dimension layer. Let's make this actually black for a second. You'll see why in a moment. The darker it is, the better to start with. We can always change the color again later. So I'm going to alpha lock this, tap once and fill, tap again to turn off alpha lock. Now, if I come over to this adjustments menu, I have these three options for blurring. And motion blur actually allows me to extend or create blur that essentially extends the edges of a design in a particular angle or direction. So what I'll do is I'll choose motion blur for the whole layer. And then if I tap and drag my pencil around the screen, you can see that it sort of pops its dimension out into different angles as I move. You can't see my hand, but like to get this effect, I'm moving down and to the left. To get this effect, down and to the right, okay? So I wanna do this to get, let's say roughly, this amount of dimension. Now I'll tap again to release that selection. All right, so now I'm left with this semi-translucent, illegible, dimensional layer. And there are a few ways that we can fill this and make it solid black, but I'll just tell you what I do, which is a little bit like honestly the easiest and sort of like the cheat way. Just duplicate this a lot of times. As soon as I get quite a few duplicates, I'll group them, tap the group once and hit flatten. Then I'll just duplicate that a couple more times. This is like 3 seconds of work. And when you're done, since we made this solid black, you get like a really crisp design. Now I'm swiping right on all of these and grouping them again and hitting flatten again. All right, so what do we have here? We have our primary layer, and below it, we have this quick dimension layer, which doesn't look like anything good yet. It looks horrible. This is not like real dimension yet. So all we do now is select that quick dimension layer and move it. I'm moving it very carefully. I'm zooming. Let me actually zoom in a little bit. I just want to make sure that, like if you look over here on the far right side of my design, I don't want it to do that. I want it to make sure that the primary design is really crisp against the background and that the dimension is fully falling off to the right and bottom. So I think, yep, I have that here now. So now let me just quickly recolor this because I don't want my dimension to be black. I'll select this darker color, tap once, alpha lock, tap again, fill, tap again, alpha lock. All right, so let's pause for a quick second. You see what just happened there? Let me turn on my previous dimension layer. I had made this, okay, slightly less dimension, but you can see it's the exact same effect. Here I made it more dramatic, just longer, but it's truly the exact same effect with much less time. So this dimension effect is what I recommend for really learning how shadows fall and dimension works. And this is the quick method for getting all of your curves perfect and geometrically spot on. All right, so I can even come in here. I can see actually that my quick dimension is still slightly blurred on the edges because remember it had some translucency before. So I'm just duplicating it 2 more times and merging down. And now I have a really crisp inner dimension. Awesome. Okay. Oh, I didn't even do that on purpose. Awesome, awesome. All right, so what I'm going to do now is create a drop shadow on this. And to do that, the drop shadow is not going to be just falling from the dimension. It's not going to be just falling from the primary word. The drop shadow actually falls from both together. The whole dimensional thing serves like one object where the drop shadow falls from that. So we have to duplicate our primary and dimensional layers. Now I will merge those 2 together and I'll move that merged layer to the bottom. I'm going to just rename this so that no confusion occurs. Okay, right now that layer looks exactly like the other layers. So let's turn it black as the shadow should be. So I'll tap alpha lock. That it doesn't matter that there are multiple colors on this layer. Alpha lock just lets you select all of the art pixels on any single layer. Come over to black, tap again and fill, tap again, and turn off alpha lock. Why do I, by the way, always say to turn off alpha lock when you're done? It's because if you leave it on and you don't remember, there will be that moment that you try to draw on that layer or blur that layer or do something and it doesn't work and you go crazy of why is my pencil not working? Has Procreate frozen? And it's just because alpha lock is on and it won't let you draw any new pixels. So turning back on my primary and my quick dimension, that is now hiding my drop shadow layer. So let's move that drop shadow in whatever direction we want. So moving the drop shadow around, let me reduce the opacity first because this is just too much to look at. Okay, cool. So moving this around, I get to decide what direction my light source is coming from. So I can do this, let's say, the same direction as my dimension. I don't personally love that. I can do it sort of an opposite direction, which would be like if the light were coming from the top right corner, kind of like that in contrast to my dimension. I don't really want the shadow to go up as if the light's coming from the bottom. So I think I'll select something like this. Now, I could go and do, again, that blur effect that I used to create the dimension. That would totally work here. But let's just go back and show you, the second phase of the previous version, because I find this part quite easy and quite fun now that you've gotten to the shadow layer and you aren't working with such thin lines. All that we're doing here is like filling in the gaps, essentially. So making sure I'm still on my shadow layer. In fact, I'll copy it and turn off the underneath shadow so that I can always return to it if I want. So here on the shadow layer, I'm coming back to my monoline pen and I'm going to just enlarge it quite a bit and I'm going to fill this in and make sure that I sort of zoom around the screen and fix any slight imperfections, filling in all of these blank inner spaces as I go. Once the inner spaces are filled in, I'll show you how to do a little bit more technical refinement as well. But any enclosed space, we're going to fill in to start with.
Molly, so that's the blanket rule here is any space that's enclosed, you always want to fill in?
For the drop shadow, yes, in the sense that if you think about, let me get a contrast color here for a second. If you think about light coming in from this side, that means that, for example, oops, let me move this to the top. Hang on. Okay, that means that, for example, this flourish is casting a shadow down below it and to the left, which means that this whole area would be covered in this shadow and this area would be covered, but this area will not. So I appreciate that you asked that question because not necessarily the whole area will. So I should rephrase this much better. The drop shadow areas to fill in are going to be the areas that are below and to the left, basically in between, stuck or caught in between the drop shadow on the bottom and the dimensional letters on the top.
And I'm sure you're going to show us in a minute, but where that lowercase e is, would it just be that bit to the bottom left of it, but nothing above it?
Both. I'm going to show you in 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll show you in
yeah.
one
I feel like it's it's like a bit of an anomaly. That one.
This is precisely where people get confused with curves. So it's a very, very valid question. But we're just starting with like the simple fill in the, like coloring book fills. Oops, coloring book fills. So I'm just going to fill in all of these areas. When I get to regions like this, I can go back to that initial rule that I had told you, which is that you can connect the outermost points that correspond with each other between the dimensional layers and connect them with a straight line. So here, for example, I would draw a straight line between these and then fill in that region. Oops. This brings me also to another small point, which is that I like things to look handmade. I would prefer for something to look optically good than to be pixel perfect necessarily. So let me show you this as like a pause and show you this as a good example. Pixel perfect wise, geometrically speaking, it would be correct to have this tiny sliver of the dimension showing above this flourish, but it kind of distracts my eye. I don't really love it. And if I erase it, nobody is going to know or care. Literally,
it was driving me mad, Molly, as well. So I'm glad you're going to get rid of that.
Exactly. So this is where I come in and I start just refining a little bit more. I'll come to my dimension layer and my eraser. You see, literally nobody will look at this and say, oh, there's a little bit of dimension missing from that top flourish. So that's what I go through and do at this point when I'm filling in the shadow spaces. Here, for example, is another fully enclosed space where the shadow is below and the dimension is above. Let's see. Okay, this is a good place for now, the further details to be added. So let's start back at the beginning. Again, we could do this again with my initial method of using the motion blur, but just to reinforce the concept here, we're going to go in and be connecting these lines again. And if I have pretty small spaces, I don't even need to drag and fill. They're actually not that hard to fill in by hand here. Oops. So your lines are going to be straight. Don't draw curved lines to connect curves. Maybe I should have said that earlier because, in fact, that is one of the more confusing aspects to people about creating dimension of curved letters. The dimension falls at a straight line, even if it's to create dimension for something that is curved. So here on these curves, for example, I'm connecting the outermost point of each curve that corresponds to each other by a straight line. I hope that makes sense. Did that explanation make sense to you, Tom?
Totally, yes.
That's good. Good. Sometimes these things that you do and take for granted after a time, you realize, well, I have to put that into words. Okay.
It's called the curse of knowledge.
I suppose so. So yeah, so we fill in all of these with straight lines. You can do it, pretty quickly now that we have one word. But again, you can imagine that if this were a whole large composition, how long this could take you. Okay, so we have the bottoms all fixed here. Now let's move up a bit. I'm continuing to go around these. This is a whole region that we haven't connected yet, so we need to connect this, fill it in. And now, let me just show you something here so you can visualize this a little bit better. Let me turn off my dimension layer for a moment. Okay, and I'm reducing the opacity very slightly. I don't normally work this way, but I'm showing it to you so that you can get a full understanding of where the shadow is right now. This rough shadow shape is what corresponds to the overturn or the curved part of the beginning of the W. So this is going to end up connecting right up here to this side. Oops, to this side. Let me turn back on my dimension now so that you can understand that. We couldn't see that full area before, but you will start to understand, for example, in areas like this, that we're going to be filling in these regions as well. I also just noticed another area similar to the flourish where I need to remove a sliver of dimension that I think is unnecessary. I'm going to also remove a sliver of this shadow that I think is unnecessary. As a side note, if you have ever used sort of old typography guides as a source of inspiration and actually traced them or broken down the type in those guides, meaning type that was created before there were computers, these typographers did use rulers, of course, and all sorts of grids and guides and graphs and stuff like that, but they are still imperfect in like a really great way. So that has always inspired me to feel like, this isn't about being pixel perfect or down to the exact millimeter. This is about ultimately what looks good and looks right. Like here, for example, I'm going to just make this more of a smooth curve because that would look much better in a shadow. Now, I always miss ones. I always have to zoom back out at the end and look and see what areas I missed. So yeah, oh boy, this area needs to get filled in because of course, this part of the W would cast a shadow down. So in fact, let me show you this way. I have the dimension turned on now. I'm going to reduce the opacity on that slightly. And this is where these would connect.
And I'm guessing if that was more like an uppercase U instead of a W,
yeah,
you wouldn't want to just keep extending that line because you'd have to be cognizant of the depth of this 3D shadow, right? So it would stop at a certain point. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it would. But if it were an uppercase, it would also have the shadow layer that we had created would have signified to us a rough idea of where that line should go, if that makes sense. I mean, you would still essentially connect the top of your shadow layer to the corresponding point on your lettering layer, your dimensional lettering. So whether it's uppercase or lowercase, I'm sure that those at home can more immediately see, because I'm so close to this, where I have forgotten to mention. But I always do, because I zoom around at like a kind of out of order angle or out of order. Let's see. And then let's see, W. What I think to myself is if light is coming down from the top right, I kind of go from side to side. And I think like if the light is, sorry. Oops, clear. Okay. If the light is coming from this angle, are all the shadows there that need to be there? So for example, this shadow is properly created. This is. You see what I'm saying? So I visually go around. I don't like that this is here and I'm going to erase it. There we go. And I just kind of go around, and it can be helpful even to think, I mean, visualize these arrows, but I'm drawing them so that we can see them. Yeah, like right here, there's actually needs to be some shadow. So I'm coming back to my shadow layer and to my black. And if I turn off, if I turn off my dimension layer for a second, you'll see that indeed this area of the E needed to correspond to this area of the E. So I'll do that now. It's going to be just a sliver of shadow, but it's still, yeah, it's still important shadow. So we have our layer turned on. Yep. So far, so good. But if you at home see where I missed something, yell at me in the comments. All right, let me change the background now to something darker because I want like this dimension to pop even more. So yeah, I like that.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah, it's like magic.
This looks like it was created in 3D software or something, Molly. But I love the control this gives you just to tidy up and perfect every single angle.
Yes, and to create more personalization or texture. I'm going to show you some tips for that in a moment. Absolutely. But it does now look pretty pixel perfect. I mean, almost like a Photoshop text effect or something like that. And of course, playing around with the color has huge impact. Like if I were to make the primary color darker and the dimension lighter, you already get a completely different impact. So that alone is something fun to play with. Now, this shadow layer, I'm going to duplicate and I'm going to save it down here at the bottom and turn it off for a second. Now, I want to add a little bit of blur because I think realistically no shadow is completely crisp around the edges, right? So you see how crisp it is now? I'm going to go on this shadow layer and I'm going to come not anymore to the motion blur, but to the Gaussian blur. I'm going to tap my pen down. If I move far to the right, I blur it way, way too much. But if I just slightly blur it, it already looks much, much more realistic. Trying to make sure, I'm looking at the screen to make sure, yeah, it's subtle, but I think you at home can definitely see that. So that to me is the final necessary effect for realism. But of course, further texture and shading can absolutely be added. So let's do some of that now. Let's add some grain to the shadow because shadows are very often grainy. So if we tap to make a new layer above the shadow and tap again and click clipping mask, now whatever we draw on this clipping mask layer is going to only affect the shadow. So I can draw some grain onto this layer and only the shadow will be grainy. So I'm continuing with black. Actually, yeah, I'm continuing with black. It's actually not going to show up very well. So let me do a different color. We'll see. We'll play with it. There's so many amazing texture brushes, but let's just go to a charcoal brush for now, for example. Oops. I'm going to turn this grain on to multiply. And the reason it's not working is because my shadow is black and reduced opacity. So there are a number of ways around this. I'm actually just going to make my shadow into light gray. So I'm tapping it, alpha lock, fill layer, alpha lock. I'll set this to multiply and reduce the opacity slightly. Now I'm just going to clear that grain that I did a second ago, and I'm going to paint that on with black. So now it's like multiplied black painting over light gray. So I'm just going to fill this in very, very lightly, just huge brush floating over the screen, and reduce the opacity on that slightly. And it makes a very, very, very subtle grain. An alternate way of doing grain on any layer is through your adjustments layer. You can add noise instead to your whole layer. And then when you tap and drag, so that's like maximum noise. This is about just a touch of noise, almost like a good shadow grain. Okay. So I do recommend that if you do that, you continue adding some more grain and some more texture to other elements of your lettering as well, because having only one element of the image be grainy doesn't necessarily look realistic. It makes the rest look even crisper and even more digital, if you will. So if you want to come in and be adding further texture to the inside of the actual lettering, let's talk about some ways to do that. So let me zoom into this A as an example. When we created our drop shadow, we decided that it would be an effect as if the light is coming in from the top right and casting a shadow that goes down to the bottom left. So if we want to create further shading inside of our letters, we should keep that same light source in mind. In fact, there are a number of ways to add texture, so I'm just telling you one here. But if I, again, make a new blank layer over my dimension, tap again and click clipping mask. I'm not going to paint with black this time. I think I just want to paint with a shade slightly darker than my dimension. So I think that this is such, yeah, that is such a shade. So what I'm going to consider is that regions like, oops, this is just too big of a brush. Hang on. Yeah, regions like the bottom of this A are the regions where the most shadow would be cast. So you can kind of use the shadow layer you already created as a cue for where you can add texture to darken the dimension. And since we're only affecting the dimensional layer, the primary lettering layer still will be unaffected. So it will still pop and look as if it is sitting on top of the textured dimension. That was a mouthful. Also going to turn this on multiply so that it's even darker. I like to put a lot of texture on multiply.
Why do I feel like you're about to blow my mind, Molly?
Well, I don't know, because this part for me can take some trial and error, but I'm going to come back and erase more in a second. So don't worry. It's sloppy at first. So what I'm doing, because you can't really see my hand, is I'm really utilizing the pressure sensitivity here. So I'm pressing down hardest where I want it to be darker, and I'm slightly releasing my pressure as I go up. I will be adjusting the darkness and doing some erasing in a moment. So I just usually like to work with the most maximum drama and then reduce it later. I would rather reduce than keep having to add. So there I took a cue from the shadow itself, right? And I came up in the regions, in the regions that the shadow has fallen on. And if we continue that throughout, for example, thinking that, remember again that I'm going to be doing some erasing in areas where it has overlapped too much, but taking a cue, from more of the shading, shadow. Sorry, I'm a weirdo with brush sizes. I'm always changing my brush sizes. Okay. I'm going to reduce the opacity even more and just go really lightly. Let's see. Here. No. This area that I just shaded, that would not be in shadow. There you go. So I'm just adding some very, very light texture to other areas. It looks still way too dramatic. So I'm going to reduce it and then work on tweaking it a little bit with my eraser tool, maybe adding a little more here and there as I go through. So I'm going to start by just erasing these regions that are not on the bottom. In a phase 2, you could go back and add even more texture there. You can really never add too much texture to a textured piece of artwork, but just make sure that you're doing it in the right places, essentially. So if you, if you want, you'll be able to come back and add even more in here. But like I said, right now, this is more focused on the regions in the bottom of the dimension, not the regions on the inside of the dimension. If I were personally doing this for a finished piece of art, I would go in and do that as its own separate layer. Does that make sense? Hope so.
Yeah.
All right. So you can see where I'm going with this. I think that our time is running short, but you can see where I'm going with this to continue just doing texture upon texture, following that light source, using the shadow layer as a cue, as a guide for where your texture will go, and just continue to layer that to keep the shading going on your dimension layer. So
I think this looks so good and it's so impressive. I can't believe it's been done by hand. That's what I keep thinking.
Thank you.
Like you say, it looks like a Photoshop text effect or some 3D software or something like that. To think this is done in Procreate by hand entirely, but it looks so clean and it has so much depth. I've never seen this kind of 3D lettering for this kind of calligraphic style before. I think it looks amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to quickly just turn off and on. I just remembered this texture layer. So if you watch, this is with it on and this is with it off. So even though I only did my first quick pass at texture here, texture and shading, you can see how much the shading adds to the realism of a drop shadow. So just saying.
Yeah, it's huge.
Saying that, yeah, it's a huge difference. So go in and continue with that. And I know like so many of your amazing Design Cuts partners do cool classes on lighting and texture alone. So I'm sure that you can also glean stuff from that you bring into your lettering too.
Would it work to have a kind of rim light? So if you had like a 1 or 2 pixel white light on the top right of your lettering? Because the light source is coming from the top right.
Yes, I thought you meant a stroke around your lettering. No, you mean just like light beams coming in from the side?
No, I kind of mean a stroke, but not all the way around the lettering, just on the top and the right to reflect
like
where the light source is coming in from.
Hang on. Yeah,
like a thin highlight, rim light kind of thing.
Yeah, we can try that.
I mean, this is me speaking with no expertise, so this could look terrible. But I was just curious if you ever anything like that.
Oops, that's on the wrong layer. Hang on. I believe that should be on the primary clipping mask. Oh, it's so light. Let's see. This is already so light that white is barely showing. Although creating streaks of light that are kind of going across my primary art layer, still not showing up very well, probably especially for you at home. Let me darken this layer slightly and you'll see what I just did. Alpha lock. Oh, no, I have to darken them all. Look at me.
Oh,
That's
no.
fine. That's fine.
What have I done with my terrible suggestion?
I'm darkening everything now. Okay, that's way too dark, but okay, what I did a second ago, this is like hyper drama here, but I went with white per Tom's suggestion and put a clipping mask into my primary layer. And then I just kind of swept with my texture brush across, and it's kind of creating indeed some cool light streaks. I'm using different pressure, and I'm drawing all at the same diagonal slant so that it doesn't look like the light is coming in from all different directions. But yeah, that would definitely look better if it's slightly reduced in opacity. Yeah, so it's just like a subtle glimmer. I think, Tom, that your idea would work, your idea would work really well, clearly, if the strokes weren't so thin. It just wasn't really showing up very well, or if I had inverted it and been using like really dark lettering.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Let's go back to my other color palette. All right.
Molly, I believe is that the end of the demo as far as the 3D lettering?
It is. Yes. I hope that.
In which case, I want to say an emphatic thank you, because that was seriously one of the best typographic sessions we've had. Just such an impressive outcome. I love how it kept building up. I kept thinking like, wow, what a great effect. Like Molly's done now. And then you'd be like, and then we can add this. And I'd be like, it looks even better. So incredible. But yeah, thank you so much. And let's give it up for Molly in the chat, please, everyone.
Thank you all so much. So many possibilities with all kinds of art, but especially with this, I always say this, but I would love to see what people create, like tag me on Instagram. I really mean that when I say it, because I just like to see where people take the tutorials and just run with it to their own imaginations.
Absolutely, yeah. If you are a digital letterer, go and check out Molly's brushes. You will not be disappointed.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
All right. See you soon, Molly. Take care. Bye.